Welcome to the Nourished Brain Podcast, where we focus on mindfulness-based whole foods nutrition and the art of empowered eating to optimize health, mood, energy, and nutritional well-being. I'm Sarah Fajera, an integrative and functionally minded registered dietitian and owner of Mindfully Nourished Solutions. Let's get you nourished. Guido Masé is a clinical herbalist, herbal educator, and garden steward specializing in holistic Western herbalism, though his approach is eclectic and draws upon many influences. He spent his childhood in Italy, in the Central Alps, and in a Renaissance town called Ferrara. After traveling the United States, he settled into Vermont, where he has been living since 1996. He is a founder, faculty member, and clinical supervisor at the Vermont Center for Integrative Herbalism, a 501c3 nonprofit herbal medicine clinic and school that provides comprehensive services focused on whole plants and whole foods. He serves as chief herbalist for Urban Moonshine, where he works on research, development, and quality control for an all-organic, whole plant tincture line. He is a founding member of the Burlington Herb Clinic, where he works in clinical practice. He participates in herbal education at the University of Vermont and is the author of The Wild Medicine Solution, Healing with Aromatic, Bitter, and Tonic Plants, and DIY Bitters. He is currently developing the Integrative Herbal Medicine Department at Waso District Hospital in Loliondo, Tanzania. Guido's teaching style focuses on conveying the interconnections within the human organism and between the organism and its surrounding ecology. Relying on clinical experience, storytelling, and scientific research, he believes that true strength flows from nature and that herbal medicine is key to sustainable, successful living. Guido, thank you so much for joining.
Sarah, it's great. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invite.
Yeah, you're so welcome. So I'll just give a little bit of background before we dive into all things bitter. Of course, working in my private practice, I'm working quite a bit with women who are struggling with all kinds of out of balance eating, including really extreme sugar cravings. And I've been really interested over the past few months in the flavor of bitter, the sensation of bitter. And I feel like every time I Google bitters and digestive bitters, your articles are coming up, Guido, and your name is coming up. And I've just learned so much from what I've read, from what you've written. And so I'm so glad to have you here to really delve in. I think you are the one. You're the one to talk all things bitter. So really
That's
glad.
really nice to say, Sarah. And I appreciate you bringing out the connection to sugar right away, because I really do think that's a big part of what attracted me to bitters to begin with, is this idea that rather than restricting or denying ourselves, one of the best things we can do is bring something in that maybe might be missing that has this amazing modulatory effect on things like our appetite, but also cravings for refined carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about your background as an herbalist, your interest in bitters, how it all started.
Well, I grew up, lucky enough to grow up in Italy with my mom and dad and my family there, who originally were based in the middle of the Arc of the Alps in a place called the Dolomites, kind of just south of Switzerland. And we did a lot of foraging growing up, things like berries, but also herbs like elderflowers. And that's where I first met plants like gentian, for example, and didn't think anything of it. It was only when I moved back to the States, when I was about 14, to Kansas City, which is right smack in the middle of the United States. Very interesting place. It took me a second, but I began to miss those outings that we would do when we'd go to the woods and gather mushrooms or berries or herbs. And so I decided that I wanted to at least start pursuing a way to bring these herbs back into my life. And long story short, I traveled around the country for a while, but ended up in Vermont in 1996 with the woman who is now my wife. And we started an herb farm and really started on this path of trying to reconnect people to these allies that grow everywhere and often taste pretty bitter and are really forgotten. And that's, I guess, why I turn to bitters a lot as really an archetypal example of what herbal medicine as a whole can offer us, which is the idea that something that is weedy and common and that has a really strong flavor that might be marginalized or forgotten and that crucially works with the body to enhance its own function can be the solution to a lot of what we consider chronic disease complaints or some of the imbalances that Western culture has brought on the human physiology.
You used the word forgotten just now. Can you tell us a little more about the history of bitter? Examples of where it might have been consumed historically, maybe where it's found in nature, and why you use that word forgotten.
Well, we don't think a lot about eating bitter things, or at least mainstream Western culture these days. In fact, the food industry has kind of gone out of its way to remove a lot of the bitterness. Think elements like bran and husk of grain, which through milling have been removed, or think about the hybridization of many of our vegetables. Even the simple carrot, which used to be kind of whitish and super pungent and bitter, has over the years turned into the familiar orange staple of the marketplace that I think tastes pretty darn sweet. So over the years, we've really shunned the bitter flavor for a range of reasons, but the most simple of which is that most people don't really like it. But historically, especially in the European tradition, which is kind of where I grew up, you see the bitter flavor kind of as a part of daily life. And it's not just from the foraged greens or garden plants like radicchio and endive that are grown in produce gardens. It's also these sort of liqueur or bitter liqueur, aperitif, amaro, as they're called in Italy, concoctions that people still pull out at the bar. And I think are also undergoing somewhat of a renaissance in the United States now. But these amari and these bitter formulae are based on some pretty old templates that come to us from the Mediterranean basin, but clearly they're not unique to the Mediterranean basin. We see bitter plants used in African herbal medicine, in the medicine of Ayurveda in the Indian subcontinent, and in traditional Chinese medicine as well. Almost every indigenous healing system values this flavor. But in the Mediterranean basin, one of the oldest examples is this stuff called the mithridate, which was considered an antidote to all poisons and was first formulated, we think, a couple of hundred years to about 100 years before the Common Era in sort of the northern shore of Turkey. And this concoction had a ton of bitter plants in it. We think things like thistle and gentian, maybe even herbs like yarrow, aromatic plants like ginger and cinnamon and some of the resins and spices that came up from Egypt and even further afield like from India. And then, a trace of sweetness. And those might include things like starchy roots, but also even things like honey. And it's debated whether this formula was liquid or whether it was in little sort of resin balls or pills. But it's called the mithridate because King Mithridates of the kingdom of Pontus was supposed to have lived a really long life and escaped a range of poisoning attempts by taking this bitter antidote to poison that guaranteed him long life. And so this same template kind of got passed on over the centuries, really through the folk traditions in most of Europe, but I'm familiar with Italy, having grown up there. And so now in Italy, we see a richness of amari, which are based on that same template, something nice and bitter as an anchor, then a personality. Sometimes it's citrus, sometimes it's more like mint or anise, and then a little bit of sweetness to round it all out. So think of Campari or Aperol as modern incarnations that you'll see in the American bar. So even though we've forgotten the bitter flavor in cuisine, you see it in the bar and liquor industry still, because that's really the thread or the trace that maintains the bitter flavor alive in modern Western culture.
So there's really some pretty deep historical roots there with the bitter flavor. When I think of bitter in the modern American diet, I think radicchio, arugula, coffee. coffee, right? And I wonder if people kind of are craving just the bitterness. I'd be interested to hear your thought about that. But when you think about, this whole idea of bitter as a forgotten flavor, and feel free to describe the different types of bitter if you'd like, what do you think are some of the really big picture considerations for well-being? Why does it matter that we're not consuming as much?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, I agree with you that coffee, first of all, tastes bitter, but
Mm.
also that it is maybe another trace of bitterness that people turn to a lot, or that they crave, or that helps satisfy that even intangible connection to this flavor that people might want. That is, if you don't put a lot of sugar and cream in it, right? But sometimes I do joke that coffee is sort of the savior of the Western culture, because it is an herb and a plant that people consume vast quantities of every day. And the bitterness in coffee, for example, is given by not only caffeine in trace quantities, but even in something like decaf, simple organic acids like phenolic acids. Chicoraic acid is an example, or caffeic acid is another. And these molecules taste somewhat bitter on our tongue. They're not the sort of pure quintessential bitter of a alkaloid like quinine that's found in tonic water, for example, just clean and almost metallic. They're a little more astringent and a little muddier, but nevertheless pretty darn bitter. And the reason that then coffee might end up being our savior in Western culture is because those bitter molecules have really profound effects throughout our GI tract, first and foremost. But they're often also a signal of high phytonutrient density. So plants that taste somewhat bitter are usually more loaded with polyphenols and simple organic acids that end up being really beneficial to our health. In the short term, though, we have to remember that as humans, our digestive systems and our liver's detox systems really evolved in the context of consuming a lot of raw botanical materials every single day. And if we go back to the idea of the carrot, those raw botanical materials were not super sweet, and they certainly weren't like the vegetables that we see in the produce department today. They contained a ton of similar compounds like the ones we still see in the coffee bean, right? And so in order to modulate the secretion of things like saliva and digestive juices, the body evolved a sensitivity to this bitterness, in part to protect the body, ramp up its digestive functions, and improve its detox functions. Because often plants that tasted really, really bitter were either loaded with a lot of these phytonutrients and secondary plant metabolites, or sometimes they were even loaded with poisons. And a lot of our strongest alkaloids, like strychnine or atropine found in deadly nightshade, belladonna, they're incredibly bitter substances. And it turns out we have fine-tuned bitter taste receptors that are sensitive to those particular molecules and elicit an incredibly strong aversive reaction in the human being. But we also have broadly tuned bitter taste receptors that kind of are looking in the background about the overall load of bitterness that we're consuming, again, with an eye to protect us from poisonous effects of plants we might forage. So now, fast forward to the 21st century, bitterness is available almost nowhere, and sweetness is everywhere. It's the exact opposite of what we would have seen in the context of, a foraging human, or even a human participating in early agriculture 10,000 years ago. So those bitter taste receptors that are broadly tuned and relying on these bitter signals to increase the production of saliva, increase the production of digestive juices, activate bile secretion from the liver, and increase the detoxification activity of the liver, those signals aren't there anymore. And all of the bitter taste receptors that are sitting, waiting for them, are kind of like fish out of water, wondering what the heck to do. Many times the digestive system, when we eat a big helping of refined carbohydrate, for example, isn't even aware that we've consumed food. So that material, already pre-digested by the processing that it undergoes, slips almost like a ghost through our digestive system. And rather than being broken down enzymatically by good, rich, strong digestive secretions, begins to ferment, creates imbalances in the gut flora of our digestive tract, potentially irritates the lining of the GI tract, and contributes to a range of digestive complaints. And it turns out that rather than focusing on limiting those carbohydrates or denying us the experience of them, one of the best things we can do first is get those bitter taste receptors back in the game so that they can stimulate the body to produce adequate digestive secretions and really ramp up the liver's detox function.
Mm-hmm.
When you do that, amazing things happen. And rather than thinking of things like metabolic dysregulation, sugar cravings, digestive disturbance as sort of side effects of the modern Western diet, we can look at it, as herbalist James Green said, as part of bitter deficiency syndrome. And bringing those bitters back in is a great way to add something rather than focus on denying or restricting in order to bring balance back into the system.
I have never heard that term before, bitter deficiency syndrome.
Well, I really credit James Green for that,
James
the
Green.
great herbalist who, helps with the California School of Herbal Studies and wrote the book, The Male Herbal, as well as a great book called The Herbal Medicine Maker's Handbook, which is a classic.
Yes, yes. Many people, when they think about receptors, taste receptors, think of the tongue. But in fact, I think what you're largely referring to here are receptors not only on the tongue. Can you talk to us where else bitter is detected or tasted throughout the GI tract or otherwise? And what does the density look like of some of those receptors compared to the tongue?
Yeah, that's a really amazing question, and it's led modern scientific research into some really amazing and interesting places. To kind of fast forward to the end, it turns out that the bitterness protects us more than from just toxic compounds from plants. Bitter taste receptors activate the body's protections against things like pathogens and bacterial population imbalances too. They really are activators of human protective function across a range of different tissues. But let's start with the tongue. When we taste something bitter on the tongue, there are bitter taste receptors all across the tongue body. Each taste bud actually has multiple taste receptors inside it. It's not like bitterness is only localized in the back of the tongue. We really can taste it with almost all of our tongue. And when that happens, when that experience occurs, you start to see a signal sent to our brainstem, which then gets relayed to our cortex. We perceive the flavor of bitterness, but also gets immediately bounced back down to all of our really GI tract. So we see our liver get stimulated by nerve endings. We see our stomach and our salivary glands get stimulated by nerve endings. And this is the way that almost by reflex, when you taste something bitter and saliva begins to increase, that juiciness is increasing in the stomach, in the liver, and in pancreatic secretions at the same time through nerve reflex. So that's really one of the major functions of actually tasting the bitterness on the tongue. And I've talked to folks about potentially swallowing capsules of gentian root or wormwood, some of our strong plants, and whether that would still work. Yes, it would, right? Because as we'll see, there are bitter taste receptors further down as well. But the experience of tasting it is really the way it was intended, right? And the way that the body's response system evolved. And it's a great way to prime the pump of digestive function to ensure optimal digestion later on. Now, bitter taste receptors are found in other areas of the GI tract too. For example, in the stomach, they're found on cells that secrete the production of gastrin. And when gastrin production increases, we see the modulation and secretion of things like hydrochloric acid, important for adequate digestion, and also for things like valve closure to prevent heartburn. We see the increased secretion of pepsin as well, an important enzyme to break down protein. Then when we move a little bit further into the small intestine, we see this really, really interesting shift or change happen where rather than these bitter taste receptors sending nerve secretion, nerve sensation out to other areas of the body or to the brain, they begin to secrete actual hormones into the bloodstream in response to bitter tasting molecules. These cells are called enteroendocrine cells. And really what that means is that they're lining the enteric system, the inside of the GI tract, but they also have an endocrine or hormonal function. They're putting hormones into the bloodstream right there next to that GI tract. So when something bitter comes down, stimulate these bitter taste receptors on the enteroendocrine cell, we see that hormones and active substances like glucagon-like peptide 1 or polypeptide YY, both of which reduce our feeding behavior and our appetite, are secreted into the bloodstream. These then feed back up to the brain and central nervous system, letting us know that, our appetite doesn't really quite need to be as intense and helping to regulate our food consumption. So by taste receptors on the tongue, we see bitters improve the secretion of all digestive juices, so that what we put into our body gets broken down chemically with little drama. Then further down, these enteroendocrine cells begin to secrete hormones that regulate our food consumption patterns. So we always say in Herbal Clinic, bitters stimulate the appetite, but reduce overeating. And it's really an amazing combination of effects. We have good digestion with less drama, and we eat a little bit less food. Now we see clinical research backing this up, right? When people eat something bitter, taste something bitter like quinine, before an all-you-can-eat buffet, they consume about 20% less food. Again, not because they're trying to restrict themselves, simply because their digestion is now operating correctly. So that's an amazing effect that bitter taste receptors have in the lower part of our GI tract. But it doesn't stop there. We also see that bitter taste receptors are found all along our respiratory passages. And this is where I think it gets really interesting, and where a little bit of the digestion research needs to catch up. So researchers at UPenn are finding that bitter taste receptors in our nasal passages, for example, detect the presence of bacterial endotoxins and quorum sensing molecules. These are molecules that bacteria secrete when they're present in adequate numbers, that they feel ready to sort of try and invade tissue and mount an attack and really start causing symptoms, right? So if we have bacteria in our sinus passages and they all of a sudden have decided that there's enough of them, they begin to secrete these quorum sensing molecules, and the bacterial culture ramps up its growth rate and begins to attack us. These quorum sensing molecules are called acyl homoserine lactones, and they're almost analogous in structure to lactones found in bitter tasting plants like angelica or dandelion root. Now, this doesn't mean that we can put, angelica tea up our nose. I really wouldn't recommend that, right? But what it does mean is that the bitter taste receptor is trying to protect us and modulate bacterial populations. Because when those bitter taste receptors in the sinuses are stimulated by these compounds, defensins are secreted, and the immune system begins to contain and control those bacterial populations. My guess, and though this is still a speculation on my part, is that those bitter taste receptor cells that are lining our intestines don't just have enteroendocrine function, but they have immunologic function as well. If they're doing it in the sinus passages, it's likely that they participate in the dance and balance of our microflora too. And when we start engaging, modulation of microflora, the ramifications and repercussions of exposing ourselves to bitters could be vast.
Systemic.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about exposure to bitter compounds as modulating overall the whole experience of appetite, and even what hunger could mean for someone. Because I know in my experience, I'm working a lot with helping women to distinguish between what is hunger, what is fullness, what is taste satiety. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty amazing to see what a complicated journey that can be to try to get to the point where those signals are even somewhat clear. So I'm just kind of sitting here wondering to myself how bringing in bitters all along that path, even when there's no really severe digestive ailment present, would impact ability to kind of restore balance or homeostasis with some of that self-regulation or identification of those cues. What do you see in clinic or while teaching or in your work as an herbalist?
Well, I think that your intuition or the direction you're going is brilliant. And it's probably the biggest gift that bitters can offer us. Yes, they're great for digestive problems if people feel like they have gas and bloating and irregular bowel habits, or a little bit of heartburn now and again. And that's what the old timers in Italy still use those amari for. And that's great, right? But the idea of the sugar craving and sort of demonizing the consumer of carbohydrate who has almost an impossible struggle ahead of them to try and fight against the food industrial complex that is putting this stuff in front of our faces every day at every turn is really missing the point. I think if we go back to the idea of restoring bitterness to our lives, we can see across the board reframing of our relationship to food. And that's the biggest gift that I think these plants can offer us. And it doesn't have to be in the form of tinctures or even, really strong herbs. It can be in the form of something as simple as a radicchio salad with olive oil and salt, right? If incorporated as part of the diet. But what we talk about with bitters are a couple of things. Often there will be a situation where an episode of what one might call moderate hypoglycemia, or at least the feeling that, you haven't eaten in 4 or 5 hours and you just picked up your kid from school and you're going back home and really we just need to stop and get some groceries. And what's the first thing I want to put into my basket? I'm just going to put those cookies and chips in there because I'm so hungry, right? And unfortunately, this leads us on a, blood sugar low back up to a blood sugar high. And eventually that roller coaster continues. And unfortunately, that high glycemia to low glycemia roller coaster grabs hold of us in a way that is really powerful and taps into some very deep physiologic responses. What's amazing about bitters is that they can interrupt that cycle in a really profound and as needed way. So if someone, and that's why I keep a little spray bottle of bitters in my car all the time. If you walk into a grocery store and you're in that state where you haven't had any food since lunch and you're really feeling that low blood sugar effect and you taste something bitter, it essentially tricks your body into thinking that food is coming and that you're starting to eat. All of the secretions begin, right? You're in the beginning of starting to eat. And it takes the brain out of that panicked feeling of needing to put something in right now. It only buys you about 20 minutes or so before the body actually figures out that you're not eating anything. It allows you to make a choice to get something like nuts instead of cookies, because that panicked feeling, that craving, has been taken out of the picture. So that's one of the really valuable ways that I use bitters right away. But over time, what we see if people consume bitters as part of the beginning of the meal, and then maybe at the closing of the meal too, is that feeling of overeating is also modulated. So, when I was growing up, I would hear people throw the idea around that you should stop eating about 5-10 minutes before you're full, because it takes a second for the brain to catch up with what's going on in the GI tract. And by the time you actually feel full, you're actually overfull. And I think this is definitely true, but it always puzzled me as to why our digestion would be built that way, because it doesn't seem very useful. It seems like it would lead to overeating more often than not. Well, what we've found is that if people consume bitterness beforehand, one of the major things that it does is astringe the valve, pyloric valve at the bottom of the stomach, and the lower esophageal sphincter at the top of the stomach. That's part of how it helps reduce things like heartburn. But it's also how it slows down the movement of food out of the stomach and into the lower part of the GI tract. And by slowing that food down, not only do we break it down better in the gastric phase of digestion, we also feel full more quickly. Plus, when the bitter substances that we've consumed before our meal arrive to those enteroendocrine cells in our small intestine, those satiety hormones begin to flow. Glucagon like peptide 1, polypeptide Y, other hormones that help reduce overconsumption. And so when you taste something bitter 5 to 10 minutes before you eat, you actually synchronize your digestive function with your food consumption pattern. So when you feel full, you are full. And that's why the clinical research shows us that 20% less food is overall consumed by a person who eats something bitter before their meal. Now, at the other end of the meal, again, it was interesting for me coming from Italy to the United States. And my mom, who's from Kansas, her parents would finish almost every meal with a dessert of some kind or another. And the sweet flavor is a really great helper for kind of closing the meal, right? And a lot of people, that's when they crave the sugar as well as at the end. So bitters, and particularly bitter liqueurs like the Amari that have that bit of sweetness in there to buffer the bitterness, are often brought out in traditional cuisine systems, and certainly in Italy, as a way to close the meal without a dessert. So you'll have, half an ounce of Amaro with some ice instead, and you'll sip it over 5 to 10 minutes. And again, it's remarkable how it interrupts that craving for sugar that might come after a meal. Now, we're not 100% sure why that craving for sugar might happen after a meal, nor are we necessarily sure why people experience, especially after high carb meals, this like food coma thing, where our brain kind of goes offline. There's a lot of potential interesting ideas also involving some immune cross-reactivity to things like gluten protein, for example. But in the context of bitters, what's interesting is that researchers in England, including herbalist Julie Whitehouse, found that when you take something bitter, even in the middle of a meal, but certainly before, the shift of blood that naturally takes place towards the GI tract when we eat, right? All this blood flows to the gut in order to help with the absorption and movement of those nutrients that we just ate, and so they can get taken to the liver through the portal vein. But that takes a lot of blood away from the brain and the heart and everything else. Well, it turns out there's bitter taste receptors on the heart too. And when bitter tasting compounds from strong bitters, Julie Whitehouse looked at plants like gentian and wormwood again, enter the bloodstream and hit these receptors on the heart, it supports the blood flow to the GI tract by tightening up the vessels that lead to the brain so that greater pressure is maintained in the brain and our brain doesn't feel as foggy or as spacey afterwards. And I think a lot of times the reason why people go for a dessert after a meal or a cup of coffee is because they're feeling a little spacey. It's pretty natural. All that blood is shifting. Turns out that bitters may help a little bit reduce that overall feeling of brain fog. And again, so many places, right? When you experience a craving because you haven't eaten in a while, when you want to reduce overconsumption before a meal, and when you want to try and not go right to the carbohydrate or to the refined sugar after your meal, bitters can help with all of those things.
Wow. You've given us a couple of, ideas just contextually from historical use or from Italy. For the individuals that you're working with as an herbalist, what do you suggest, as far as ideas for specific foods or herbs or digestive bitters and tonics? I mean, clearly, physiologically, bitters have such an important role in maintaining tone and digestive function. And my gosh, little did I know. There's just so many promising uses even on the horizon. So, talk us through kind of practical tips and strategies. What do you find works best for people who are just starting to, yeah, dive in? Maybe even for those who struggle with
Mm.
with bitter, who aren't used to it and aren't sure they really like it very much.
Well, I wouldn't blame you. I think bitter is definitely an acquired taste.
Mm,
As we get older, our bitter taste receptor density on our tongue, and we also think maybe in other parts of the body goes down a little bit.
mm,
That's part of the reason that kids are just like, don't even give me the broccoli, right? They're super tasters of bitter. And again, that goes back to the bitter taste receptors trying to protect us, especially when we're tiny and our livers aren't very big and we can't handle as big a dose of poison. But because of all their important effects and really that restoration of the bitter deficiency, it's important to bring them back in as adults too. And it turns out that when you do, you actually go back to being more sensitive to bitter. The diversity of bitter taste receptors on your tongue shifts and changes. And of course, that makes sense, right? The more you expose your tongue to bitter, the more the body wants to be on the lookout. It's like this person is eating wild plants again. We better make sure they don't poison themselves. So the bitter taste receptor density increases too. But the good news is that that ends up helping us a lot.
mm.
So it really is great to be able to try and pull bitters into your life in a lot of different ways. So the entry points I think that are easiest, or I don't know, maybe gentlest, involve simple bitter greens. And if you can move past the romaine and iceberg type greens that are usually found in salad mixes and get a little more adventurous, you can move towards things like radicchio or endive. And yes, they're bitter. They're based on a plant called chicory. In its natural state, it's extremely bitter, but they also have a nice crunch and they're juicy and they have a little bit of sweetness. And that said, the old template that they used to make the mithridate of adding a little bit of sweetness to the bitter is always a good idea. So if you make a radicchio salad, think about drizzling it with a little honey as well as olive oil and a little bit of salt, just a tiny bit, just so you have that little bit of sweetness while you're tasting the bitter. And you'll get a reward as well as a little bit of this, whoa, bitter taste receptor stimulation. What I found is that when I suggest this to clients, they're either all in because they're super foodies and they want to try all this different stuff, or they say like, wow, getting this different vegetable and like preparing a salad, that might be a little difficult for me at first. So if practicality and being able to bring bitters with you on the go is one of the important things for you and for your life, I do really suggest the idea of a digestive bitter in liquid form, with the caveat or the caution that most of these are extracted in alcohol. So you're not taking a lot of alcohol, but it is about 40 proof. So just to be aware, you typically only need about 30 drops. And the dose of ethanol overall in there is about the same as you would get in a banana from natural fermentative processes. But still, for some people, that's just not right. But if you don't mind having that little bit of alcohol, herbalists will take the herbs in digestive bitters and steep them in alcohol to extract their chemistry and their flavor profiles. And again, it's based a lot of times on that old formula, something bitter, something aromatic with a personality, and a touch of sweetness to round it all out, right? You can find a lot of different bitters available on the market. And they often come in dropper bottles, sometimes in spray bottles, which again, I find really convenient. You can carry them with you on the go and really apply them to the tongue in liquid form, which is a great way to get the benefit of bitter, even when you're not in your kitchen or when you don't feel like having a bitter salad. But I really do encourage you to think about foods that have more bitterness in them on a daily basis. And that includes simple things like washing your apple and eating the peel, keeping your peels, which are bitter, on carrots and on potatoes. It'll introduce a trace of bitter compounds, but that's part of the magic, right? And it's also where all the phytonutrients are in those vegetables. Then you may want to think about doing some very simple bitter teas. One of the simplest ways to go, especially if you like coffee, I don't begrudge, a cup or two of coffee in the morning. It's awesome. I like it before exercising. It really gets me going. But if you want something in the afternoon that has kind of a similar flavor, but that doesn't have the caffeine, think about doing a roasted dandelion root instead of a ground coffee in your French press or in your drip coffee maker. It's really easy to do. If you get dandelion roots from an herb store, they usually come already chunked up or cut and sifted. And you can take those and you can roast them like you would walnuts or almonds in a cast iron pan or in a skillet until you get a little bit of nuttiness coming up into the air. And then just dry those out and put them right in your coffee maker or your French press, however it is you would normally brew coffee. You can grind it down to a finer grind in a coffee grinder. And then it brews beautifully. You can add a little milk or soy milk or a little bit of honey and a little touch of maple syrup. And it makes a great warm and bitter beverage that's also loaded with amazing prebiotic starches, right? Then if you want to get a little more sort of fancy and sophisticated, you can think about bringing bitters into your cocktail culture, if that's part of what you like. So the digestive bitters aren't just used as digestive supplements, but people will make some real bitter cocktails. Something as simple as whiskey with a little simple syrup and a strong aromatic bitter, or the use of things like Suze, which is a ginseng liqueur for mixed drinks, or even things like absinthe or Jägermeister, which, believe it or not, are based on those traditional bitter templates. So these, along with all of the amari, can be brought in after a meal and sipped slowly over time to help kind of close that meal like we were talking about earlier. Finally, one of my favorite ways, and that's for people particularly who don't like alcohol or want to try something different, is to make what are called bitter pastilles. And they're really, really simple to do. A pastille is basically a little pill. And actually, a lot of traditional herbal medicines in Europe and in China and in India were produced this way. You get a bitter herb like gentian root, and you get a powder of it if you can, or you powder it in a coffee grinder. And you add your personality herb, like fennel seed if you tend towards gassiness, or mint if you really like mint, or a little orange peel, right, if you like that particular citrus flavor, or lemon peel. And you grind those into a powder as well, about equal parts with the gentian root. And then you bind it together with honey until the texture is just right, that they're held together as pills, but they are not sticky anymore. And you can put those in a little tin, and you can open the tin and bring it out before a meal. Take 2 or 3 at a time to really stimulate those digestive juices and get your appetite and consumption in line with the beautiful meal that awaits you.
Oh, fantastic. So it's an herbal Altoid.
Exactly.
Wow, what a fantastic idea. Great guidance, Guido. So yeah, I mean, thinking about all of this, my gosh, big takeaways for you when you think about, so not only the role of bitters historically, This whole idea of there being a deficiency syndrome, right, and all the ramifications of that for health and well-being and cravings and appetite regulation, knowing that there really are some quite accessible techniques or strategies that can be adapted. I love all of these. The dandelion root coffee, my gosh. Yeah, what would you say are really kind of summary closing thoughts when you think about, what's coming down the pike, perhaps, or what you're really enjoying, seeing as it relates to bitter, either in the literature, in what you're reading with other herbalists in your practice? What are your big takeaways to close us?
Well, I think, first of all, it's amazing to see the craft bitter revival happening. And it's coming from the bar, but it's a beautiful thing. And you have access, if you want to take bitters medicinally, to an amazing flavor combination, all of which are based on these important bitter plants, and all of which will help with many of the things we talked about this evening. But I'm most interested from a research perspective in this potential interface between bitter tasting herbs and the body's immune system and immune function. I'm wondering if there will be immunoregulatory or modulatory connections discovered that might have implications for autoimmune disease or hypersensitivity. One of the traditional uses of bitter herbs like gentian, and also bitter seeds that have an effect on the liver, like milk thistle seed, in Europe is for allergies and autoimmune disease. That might be connected to enhancement of liver detox function. It might be connected to a direct effect on immune function, but I think these are really very, very interesting and promising places to continue looking at the effects of bitter tasting compounds in the human body. What brings me back to bitters is there this quintessential incarnation of what I think herbal medicine does best and can really offer as a gift to our culture, which is these allies that help us be stronger, that work with us rather than attempting to do our work for us. And if you think about it in the context of digestion, you can take a digestive enzyme, you can take a hydrochloric acid pill, you can take a proton pump inhibitor to limit acid because you have too much heartburn, basically pushing the body one way or another, or trying to apply the secretions that the body makes from an outside source because somehow we know or we understand exactly what the body wants. Our wisdom really isn't as profound as the wisdom of the pancreas when it comes to balancing and regulating digestive secretions in response to our food. And so the herbalist says, well, rather than guessing at what the body might need, let's restore the operating context. And that's exactly what bitters do. We restore the operating context, at the very least, in digestive function, in appetite, and in liver detox function. There might be a lot more that bitter context brought to, the early human being as we evolved, or brings to all animals, because in truth, they all consume these bitter tasting plants, right? Yes. And that is that maybe our immune system and our inflammatory processes are connected to bitterness too, and are modulated by it. But at the very least, our operating context was loaded with bitter tasting plants for the vast majority of our evolutionary history. In the last 100 years, we've been able to change that. The experiment has gone on for a few generations, and now we're seeing its effects. And I think part of the diabetes and obesity issues that we see a lot in Western culture isn't just the increase in carbohydrate, but it's the deficiency of bitterness, right? As it turns out, though, and what herbalists will tell you is bitterness is just the beginning, because in fact, there's a massive plant deficiency syndrome that herbalists are trying to correct. And we see that, our cardiovascular system, our gene expression at the level of DNA, all of these crucial systems of regulation in the human body have places in them that are able to interface with botanical compounds. And so not just with digestion, as bitters teach us, but all across the human physiology, the integration with the botanical world is an essential part of how healthy human being exists on this planet. And if a little bit of a bitter aperitif and its positive effects on digestion is what it takes for that to kind of crystallize in people's minds, then that's great. Because what I saw in my clinic that I think was most profound was a gentleman that came back to me after taking a simple dandelion root liquid extract a few times a day to help with his digestive problems. When he came back to me and he said, it's those dandelions. And it's those dandelions I've been spraying with Roundup in my lawn. I don't think I'm going to do that anymore. then the circle closes. And we see that when we restore the human being to its operating ecological context, then the human being is able to effectively and respectfully participate with the ecology again, too. So bitters don't just heal our digestive tract and reduce toxicity inside us. They help change our mindset around carbohydrate overconsumption and the agricultural practices that are associated with carbohydrate overconsumption. Massive, multi-hectare corn and wheat fields that are polluted with industrial agrochemicals. Imagine if we all decided we didn't want to spray Roundup on our dandelions anymore and began to leave some of these wild, forgotten plants in the corners of our fields and in the corners of our urban gardens, made medicines with them, harvested them for greens, felt better ourselves, but also helped the ecology feel better by increasing diversity of botanical species, which helps pollinators, which reduces consolidation of agriculture, which really helps close that loop. When human beings are connected to wild plants, they become more engaged with the ecology. And we can't help but think of the ecology as having meaning, agency, consciousness, and connection when we start doing that. And as a result, we treat the ecology with more respect. So the experiment of removing the bitterness hasn't just hurt us as individuals, it's hurt the ecology too. Restoring the bitterness can help restore meaning, value, and respect for both.
So really beautiful closing thoughts. Thank you, Guido, for sharing your experience and your wisdom, and what a depth of knowledge. Where would you suggest that people go if they've been really intrigued by this conversation, to see more of your work, to learn more about bitters overall? Any books you'd recommend, or where can people find you?
Well, a lot of herbalists have done some amazing work around bitters. I recommend, for just a quick intro read, Jim McDonald wrote a great article called Blessed Bitters that is available on the internet. I take it a little further in my work, and so I've put together a couple of books. One is exclusively for bitters. It's called DIY Bitters, and it includes some recipes for not only making digestive bitters and cocktails, but also some of the other things we talked about.
Great.
In my first book, The Wild Medicine Solution, I talk more about sort of correcting plant deficiency syndrome, and the whole chapter on bitters goes much deeper into the pharmacology of the bitter taste receptors and some of the historical notes, like the story of King Mithridates and the first digestive bitter elixir. But you can also find a lot more information on bitters at North Carolina State University, in the Institute for Plants and People, and the work of Slava Komarnitsky. They're looking at bitters as enteroendocrine cells, and some of the metabolic regulatory effects there. Again, Julie Whitehouse and folks at Imperial College in London, who wrote a great paper called Bitters, Time for a New Paradigm back in 2015, that gets into some of the more systemic effects of bitters. And finally, we try and publish, or I try and publish some updates on what we are now learning about the emergent science around bitters. And a lot of those will come through the blog at urbanmoonshine.com, which is the digestive bitters company that I work with. And I like the bitters we make. I'm biased, clearly, but there's a lot of good information also on Urban Moonshine's website about the bitters and bitter taste receptors and all the good stuff that they can do for us.
Wonderful. Fantastic. So rich array of resources to tap into, and to integrate some of these concepts into daily life, and experience all these wonderful benefits we've been talking about. What a treat to hear all this, Guido. Thank you. Thank you again for your time and for the investment of energy. Anything you'd like to close us off with? Closing thought?
No, I think that's it.
All
I really
right.
want to thank you, Sarah, as well. Again, thanks for the invite and sort of being on board with this. I think it's really exciting stuff, and thanks for the work you do as well.
Very good. Thanks, Guido. Good night. Sarah here, owner of Mindfully Nourished Solutions. It's my goal with this podcast to explore strategies for empowered and well-informed food and eating decisions. If this information has been supportive to you, please head over to iTunes to rate this episode and to leave a review about what was most helpful. To learn more about how food is impacting the way you feel on a day-to-day basis, head over to my website at mindfullynourishedSolutions.com for a copy of my free food mood journal. See you next time.